Hi and welcome. Today, Omar and myself, Shelly, are going to talk about TWA Flight 800 crash. An overview of what we're going to be talking about. What happened with Flight 800, Transwest Airlines? Who were the key players? What were their roles? Community preparedness assessment and changes to emergency management as a result of TWA Flight 800. To begin, I will give a brief overview of the event. On July 16, 1996, TWA Flight 800 took off from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport to Paris. 12 minutes after takeoff, the airplane exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, about 5 miles east of Moriches Bay, Long Island. It was the third deadliest aviation accident in U.S. territory, and there were 230 people on board, including 18 crew members, all of whom died. The investigation took 2 years, with theories that the plane exploded due to a bomb, missiles, or that it had a mechanical malfunction. After 2 years of investigation, no conclusive finds were made, but the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, determined that the probable cause of the TWA Flight 800 accident was an explosion of the center wing fuel tank, resulting from ignition of the flammable fuel air mixture in the tank.
Okay, so some key players in regards to TWA Flight 800. The main one was, the big one was the NTSB. The NTSB is a federal agency tasked by Congress with the investigation of every civil aviation accident in the U.S. However, they are also charged with investigating significant accidents caused by other modes of transportation, such as railroad, highway, marine, and pipeline. The NTSB investigates, determines the most likely cause of the accident, and will then issue safety recommendations. The NTSB has a board that is comprised of 5 members that are nominated by the President and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Next slide, please. The NTSB, they were brought about by the Air Commerce Act of 1926. In 67, Congress consolidated all transportation agencies into the DOT, or Department of Transportation. And in 74, the NTSB was separated from the DOT to become its own agency. In 96, Congress enumerated new powers to the NTSB, making it now responsible for coordinating federal assistance to victims and families of victims of aviation accidents. In 2000, the NTSB established the NTSB Academy, which underwent a name change in 2006 to the NTSB Training Center. Next slide, please. So the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy were also involved. The U.S. Coast Guard is one of the 5 military branches here in the United States, but it actually operates under the Department of Homeland Security and not the Department of Defense. It was actually commissioned before the Department of Navy. Since its inception in 1970, the U.S. Coast Guard has been involved in countless maritime interdiction operations, cleanup operations, and they're America's premier search and rescue agency. They've also taken part in military operations overseas, and they are basically headed up by the commandant, who is then supported by the vice commandant. And then there's the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy is tasked with maintaining, training, and equipping combat-ready naval forces. They were established 8 years after the Coast Guard in 1798. And the naval command structure is such that you have a Secretary of the Navy, who then directs his 2 subordinates, which are the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And operational forces are then answerable to either the chief or the commandant. Next slide, please. TWA, this is who this centers around. Trans World Airlines is now a defunct U.S. airline company. In 1930, with the passage of the Airmail Act, of 1930, Western Air Express and Transcontinental Air Transport were merged, and the result of that was TWA. Howard Hughes, their most famous owner, took a controlling percentage in the company in 1939. And over the course of the next decade, TWA would become one of the most powerful airline companies in the world. But during the 50s, TWA ran into major financial problems, and things only got worse with the economic slump of the late 80s and early 90s, and that coupled with airfare wars and airline mergers would eventually lead to TWA's bankruptcy and sale to American Airlines in 2001. Boeing is a major player in commercial, defense, and the space industries. It is one of the most successful, if not the most successful, airplane manufacturer in history. It was founded by William Edward Boeing in the Pacific Northwest, but they moved recently to Chicago. Next slide, please. So the Red Cross. The Red Cross, everybody knows who they are, but just real quickly, they're a disaster relief organization, and they respond to approximately 70,000 disasters across the U.S. each year. For over 100 years, people know the Red Cross as a symbol of selfless service. However, they are primarily tasked with providing shelter, general health, mental health, and food services to victims of disasters. It is also a major source of blood donations, and they also do a lot of training within the U.S. for things like community preparedness. The Red Cross operates internationally also. Clara Barton established the Red Cross on May 21, 1881, and it actually first responded to Michigan victims of a forest fire on September 4, 1881. In response to TWA 800, on October 9, 1996, because of this tragedy, Congress passed the Aviation Disaster Act, which led to the creation of the Red Cross Aviation Incidents Response Teams. And they have the responsibility of assisting families of victims involved in aviation disasters. Next slide, please. The FBI. So the Federal Bureau of Investigations, They were established in 1908 by General Charles Bonaparte during the Roosevelt administration. For nearly 100 years, the FBI's mandate was unchanged, and that was basically to investigate cross-jurisdictional crime within the U.S. However, in 2001, in response to the September 11 Twin Tower attacks, when President Bush signed the U.S. Patriot Act into law, then Director Robert Mueller accepted the responsibility on behalf of the FBI to now be one of the leaders in counterterror operations. So that means that they're now operating overseas, and they also have taken on a lead role when it comes to cybersecurity here in the U.S. With the rise of sophisticated digital attacks on U.S. government information as well as major corporations, the FBI has taken one of the frontline roles in combating this. Interpol, which is international police, is the world's single largest international police organization. Currently, it has 190 member countries. The mission of Interpol is to preventing and fighting crime through enhanced cooperation and innovation on police and security matters. Interpol is a little bit interesting. They have a General Assembly, in which delegates are appointed by each of its member countries. The General Assembly will then elect an executive committee, which is headed by a president, and that executive committee makes sure that it steers Interpol in the direction that the General Assembly would like. Next slide, please. Also involved in the response or investigational aspect of this was Mossad, which is Israel's intelligence agency that was formed in 1949. and also the NSA, or the National Security Agency, and they're the premier code-breaking agency in the United States. So they use cutting-edge cipher-breaking techniques and algorithms to basically provide the military and civil law enforcement with the best information that they can have. Next slide, please. we have one of the major players on the public health side in conjunction with the Red Cross was the New York State Psychological Association disasters, their disaster crisis response network. They actually operate under a three-pronged attack. They provide education and training, so they will disseminate educational information and strategies to the general public, to disaster response agencies and other mental health professionals. They also provide free short-term crisis counseling. So this is basically pro bono short-term crisis intervention counseling provided by the statewide network of volunteer licensed physicians. And then the third thing they do is they take immediate action in intervention and assistance to disaster and crisis response agencies and the public volunteer intervention. So what they will do is they will try to get, basically, I guess for lack of a better term, boots on the ground as fast as they can to an incident such as people involved in an airplane crash or people affected by hurricanes and tornadoes, victims of violence, war, whatever it might be. Next slide, please. So as far as the role of the public health players, most of the public health response was coordinated by the Red Cross, and it focused heavily on mental health and family members who were affected by the tragedy. Most of what we got is based on people writing personal essays or people writing article for a magazine of what happened. There was also a secondary and equally important response that was mobilized to help with the mental health and of the individuals tasked with the cleanup and recovery operations, such as TWA workers, Coast Guard members, Navy divers, and also the mental health workers themselves who were listening to all of these grieving and disturbed people. The mental health aspect of the cleanup and recovery was a huge effort in keeping the already tragic situation from getting out of hand, due to the fact that the actual investigation was seen by many as a failure. It was rife with interagency turf wars, misinformation, delays, and it was also what most people would say the most crippling thing about it was they had very ineffective public communication. Social workers and trained mental the same hotels as the families and conduct operations where the families would congregate outside of the hotel. They also were present in pretty moderate numbers where the cleanup and recovery operations were taking place. The fact that the FBI was repeating that TWA was brought down due to terrorism, but they had really no evidence to substantiate the claim. The search and rescue, salvage, and investigation slowed to what was considered unacceptable levels for the families who were affected. This became even more inefficient because the FBI, NTSB, and Interpol were all conducting separate investigations, with the NTSB and FBI putting out statements without consulting one another. Despite these challenges, the mental health operations that were being conducted between the Red Cross and New York's disaster crisis response network seemed to be working in keeping families calmed and cared for. Next slide, please. So the assessment of the response. The FBI and the NTSB were at odds. They kept on fighting with each other. The FBI wouldn't let the NTSB do their job. The NTSB actually accused the FBI of stonewalling them. One example was a ATF report in 1999 that came out that claimed that the FBI did not give the NTSB a CIA report that had come out. and that they thought was important, but they stopped the NTSB from getting that. Of course, the FBI denies that. Who knows what really happened? The response by the investigating agencies was a mess. The FBI and NTSB, they actually reacted to each other as adversaries. The FBI did not allow the NTSB to direct investigations the way they should have. Interpol, Mossad, and Jordanian intelligence were all conducting their own investigations parallel to the one being conducted, but nobody was talking to anybody. They were all keeping information to themselves, and in the end, the brunt of this was felt by the families who were affected by this, causing them a lot of anxiety, and there was a lot of distrust amongst the public. Next slide, please. So despite these problems, and there were significant problems on the investigative end, the public health response, which centered around mental well-being of those affected by the tragedy and involved with the cleanup, did a really good job of coordinating and conducting outreach to those who needed help. The Red Cross was present, like I said before, at the hotels where the family members were staying, as well as the work sites. And they were supported by the New York State Psychological Association's Disaster Crisis Response Network. And their members helped not just the Red Cross, but also civil defense workers. One interesting study that shows how well the mental health aspect of this response was showed that divers who were exposed to the remains and the wreckage of the exploding airplane, they had an impact of event scale, or an IES. And this scale basically measures avoidant thoughts and behaviors that are basic to post-traumatic stress disorder. So the divers who are exposed to this, they had an IES score that was nearly identical to those divers who were not exposed to it. So they had some divers who were on scene for consulting purposes, and then they had the divers who were going out. The mental health aspect of this response was so good that they each had the same, relatively speaking, the same IES scores. And you know, that shows how well both the Red Cross and the Disaster Crisis Network were functioning. Next slide.
So now for an evaluation of the community preparedness. Of course, the initial feeling of shock came to those who knew people on board TWA Flight 800. But after that initial feeling of shock and loss came anger due to the manner in which the tragedy was handled. Many went on to even say that the aftermath was a disaster in itself, much like what Omar just referred to in his response to the role of key players. There were no rules in place prior to the crash in 1996 of who was responsible to notify the victims' families, and at that time it was the airline that was responsible for doing so. TWA initially only had a head ticket agent at JFK Airport to handle the incoming Russia families wanting answers. The mayor at the time, Rudy Giuliani, said that TWA was woefully inadequate in the areas of planning and communication, two aspects that are very important in terms of responding to a disaster. The deputy director of the mayor's office of emergency management responded that risk managers must realize the importance of having a high-ranking official on hand to answer questions and provide direction after a disaster, something that TWA did not have in place. Due to the lack of direction and knowledge at the time, inaccurate information was released, and there was lots of false speculation that was only compounded by the media. In conjunction with the false speculation and inaccurate information, all the key players had a different agenda. The mayor was concerned about notifying victims' families, the potential of environmental damage, and keeping the public informed. The Coast Guard was busy recovering evidence from the water, and families were waiting for word concerning their loved ones. Ideally, those agendas would have all come together at some point, and a recommendation to this response was to establish a unified plan and meeting with officials and agencies who will be involved in a recovery effort before an incident occurs, much like we learned with our training for ICS. All those who responded to the accident needed help with mental health after the cleanup of the disaster. Luckily, the Red Cross and the New York State Psychological Association for Disaster Crisis Response Network was there, like Omar mentioned, and seemed to be working to help families and those involved in the cleanup. A psychologist who responded to the disaster noted that dealing with methods of approaching family members and opening discussion with them is critical. Being quickly assigned to specific and clearly defined tasks is essential. Having the opportunity to discuss your experience with other mental health workers and with supervisory staff is an important aspect of disaster work. So it's good that New York had those community partners in place to help with the mental health aftermath. Changes to emergency management as a result of TWA Flight 800. As you can imagine, there was a lot to learn from TWA Flight 800. NTSB Chairman Jim Hall remarked before the National Emergency Management Association that local jurisdictions were not prepared for the consequences of a once-in-a-lifetime event like a major airline crash. He wasn't criticizing them or saying to be prepared for such a rare event, which I found interesting in light of what I learned from the ICS courses, which of course don't prepare communities for every incident that could possibly happen, but do have a structure in place so communities can respond to whatever comes their way. He did, however, add that when a major accident like this happens again, NTSB will contact the appropriate state emergency management agency to let them know who is responding and when to expect them, so that the appropriate agencies can meet and coordinate arrangements for the course of the on-scene investigation. This was a direct result from the TWA Flight 800 accident and was directed by President Clinton for the Safety Board to coordinate all federal services to the families of victims of major transportation accidents. Under this new authority, NTSB was tasked with providing speedy and accurate information about the accident and recovery efforts and ensuring that all families, regardless of where they were, on-site or not, received all necessary assistance and opportunities for counseling and other support. Working with state and local authorities and with private relief organizations to ensure appropriate coordination of the services, they provided with those of the federal government, and that the departments of state, defense, justice, health and human services, and transportation, and FEMA will cooperate fully with the Safety Board in these efforts. In addition, the board was required to appoint an independent third party for mental health. The American Red Cross was chosen for this role, and as Omar mentioned previously, as AIR, Red Cross Aviation Incident Response Teams, they assist the families of victims involved in aviation disasters, which was passed in Congress as the Aviation Disaster Family Act of 1996. Prior to 1996, air carriers were not required to have an emergency response program. Some carriers, like American Airlines, had an emergency response team of trained volunteers with a full-time dedicated director, but many others were not as organized or had programs that did not address the needs of passengers and their families, or had no programs at all. Air carriers, local responders, and federal agencies did not provide an effective coordinated effort to meet the needs of family members and survivors after these accidents. Therefore, the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act of 1996, also called the Family Assistance Act, brought definition and clarity to the duties and responsibilities of the primary parties involved in the response to aviation disasters. Airlines, NTSB, and the American Red Cross, which was described in the Act as an independent nonprofit organization with an experience in disasters and post-trauma communications with families. The Act gives NTSB instead of the airline, responsibility for coordinating services to the families of victims of fatal aircraft accidents in the United States. It also attempts to protect the families of accidents victims by prohibiting attorneys and their representatives from having unsolicited communication concerning a potential action for personal injury or wrongful death with a victim's family for the first 30 days after an accident. In addition, the Act provides for the creation of a task force consisting of representatives of the NTSB, FEMA, and the American Red Cross, air carriers and their employees, families of victims of aircraft accidents, and other appropriate agencies to study the need for modification to laws or regulations that would result in improvements to the treatment of family members of victims of aviation disasters, including, among other things, issues relating to the treatment of families by the media and legal community. Also, in response to the public outcry and media attention focused on airline safety, Congress soon undertook the task of amending the Death on the High Seas Act, or DOSA. DOSA was a 1920 statute that limited damages suffered by victims of airline disasters to economic losses only. The amendment would allow recovery for loss of consortium, care, and companionship in all cases of commercial aviation accidents. This measure was passed by the U.S. Congress and became law in April of 2000. The amendment retroactively applies to commercial aviation accidents occurring after July 16, 1996, which is the day before the TWA Flight 800 disaster. These are our references if you would like to learn more, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation about TWA Flight 800.